On today's episode, I'll be talking to Danny Rensch, the chief chess officer of chess.com, about his new book, except the interview you're about to hear actually has very little to do with chess. Becoming a childhood chess prodigy and co-founding a massively successful chess website weren't even the most interesting parts of Danny's life. Danny Rensch was born into an Arizona-based cult called the Church of Immortal Consciousness, which was started up by a husband and wife couple named Stephen and Trina Camp. Danny spent his childhood at the cult compound, known as the Collective, in a remote Arizona village called Tonto. There, Trina would preach to the membership by entering a trance state and channeling the supposed wisdom of a 14th century English medicine man whom she called Dr. Duran. It was a weird and at times abusive milieu, and one that Danny escaped successfully only because of his genius at chess. By the time he was a teenager, Danny was traveling around Arizona, and then the United States, winning chess tournaments and eventually attaining the rank of international master. But Danny's chess success also contributed to the breakup of the cult, as the adults around him competed to control his chess career. This included his mother, a tragic figure who was often manipulated by the men around her, and Danny's estranged father, named Stephen Rensch, who served as the cult leadership's de facto security officer. In the Church of Immortal Consciousness, Stephen Camp, Trina, and the imaginary Dr. Duran would control people's lives by instructing them on their cosmically ordained purpose. That word purpose was capitalized in cult literature to signify its supposed supernatural significance. Men and women were matched together romantically on the basis of something called their like vibration. But of course, if the powers that be in the collective decided that this like vibration had vanished, couples could be torn apart, and children could even be taken from their parents and moved from home to home. Amazingly, Danny Rensch not only survived all this, but grew up to become a world-class chess player and the co-founder of the most important chess website in the world. Although, as he'll discuss, it's taken a lot of therapy to help him get over the scars he endured from his childhood in the Church of Immortal Consciousness. Please enjoy my interview with Chess.com Chief Chess Officer, Danny Rensch. Danny Rensch, thanks so much for joining the Quillette Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so was this book an act of therapy that became a literary project, or was it a literary project that became an act of therapy?
Can I just start off by saying that might be the best first question I've gotten on a podcast? That is a great question. Because I feel like sometimes I define great questions by the fact that I don't know the answer off the top of my head, because I think you are right in observing it was probably a little bit of both. If I may, I'll tell a little bit of the story of how I got there, because I think it kind of explains what I thought I was doing to some degree, and how I came to kind of agree to the idea that I would finally tell my story, and that I would, really do so in a way where I was committed to putting it all out there, including my own issues and my own warts, if you will. Not just sort of submit yet another salacious, scandalous cult story. I wanted to talk really real about how I feel about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and all that stuff. And I think to some degree, I did enter selfishly for those reasons, kind of as you said, meaning I kind of entered into the idea that, like, I've been approached now by a lot of people who are interested in my story. I'm going to have an opportunity to sort of be paid to write a memoir. And even though it's not much money in terms of what people think, I have an opportunity to really think about my life in a way that I haven't. And so I guess selfishly kind of do my own therapy to sort of understand what I feel about my journey. And I'm never going to have a better opportunity to connect the world that people know me in, which is as kind of the face of chess.com in this made up chief chess officer title, helping to do what I do, and my backstory. I'm never going to have a better opportunity to do this. And then I think as I wrote the book and we sort of committed to doing all those things I just said, the words sort of took on a life of their own a little bit, right? And that not only showed up in terms of the through line that I really found was the most meaningful to kind of share about, my relationship with chess, my relationship with the cult leader, my relationship with my mom, and then ultimately how all those things got me where I was. In some ways, I think I guess I know it sounds sort of like airy fairy or like a cliche line, but in some ways, like the story kind of took on a life of its own. And that is to say that it's obviously a true story, but in some ways, what we chose to focus on, versus a lot of other things about the collective that don't even go in. A lot of other examples, in terms of even things I went through, abuse that I went through that ultimately I didn't feel was necessary to share.
Part of my writing career, I've been a ghostwriter, and I've worked on a bunch of ghostwriting projects with very successful people. But I don't think I've worked on a project where a person is telling his or her life, where at one point during the editorial process, they didn't have an emotional breakdown because they revisited something that they didn't want to revisit. And sometimes that's been with clients who we actually visit a location. So I've one clear memory of a very successful corporate guy, and we went back to his old high school. And I don't think I expected it or he expected it, but he really had a strong emotional reaction to some of the stuff that had gone on like 50 years earlier in his life. When you were writing this, did you geographically revisit that place? I think it's what, like two hours north of Phoenix, this little community.
It was a very difficult emotional roller coaster. And I've said, not jokingly, people think I'm joking, like, if I was told what an ordeal this would have been, I probably would have said no, just especially given what's been on our plate at chess.com. Like, it's been such a crazy ride. And yeah, it has been very taxing. In fact, my therapist openly told me that she hated that I was writing this book because
Really?
I was revisiting traumatic memories. And, therapy, in my opinion, having been in it for a long time and educated myself in a lot of ways as far as rewriting the neurosynapses of my own damaged brain, I think good therapy really focuses on the present, and then you revisit as much of the past as is needed for you to be the best version of yourself now, for you to not be as triggered by things now. You're not actively looking for more damage. You're not actively looking for more skeletons in your closet all the time, right? And it's a very delicate process. And I think good therapy should start with, hey, I don't like that I still get really angry about this. So let's review what the trigger is, how it got there. Maybe now we're talking about my relationship with my dad, but that's not the fundamental thing, right? It's really about helping me. But this process of writing a book was like fundamentally going looking for things that were traumatic, right? To sort of like talk about that. And so, yeah, I just want to say that it really was an ordeal. And as far as visiting places, yes, I went back to Tonto Village at least a couple times during writing the process. And I would say that because I also still have an arm's length relationship with my dad and stepmom, Marlo, to the level that I do, where which is something I share at the end of the book, and I have made peace with and healed to the best degree possible. And I love my dad, even obviously with all the things that we went through. It's been hard. So to say that I had opportunities to revisit the place, even if that's sort of a metaphor, the answer was yes. Right, there were definitely a lot of things that were directly in my face, reviewing about my relationship with my father or with Stephen Camp, and then having this relationship that I was revisiting. And ultimately, of course, I shared my book with my dad as well. And that has been its own journey over the last few months.
Your dad is an incredibly interesting character in the book, and one of the things that makes your story so credible is that everyone in the book, I only have your voice to go by, but it feels like you're giving them their due. There's one scene I remember where I think your dad was shaving and he had accompanied you on a chess trip, and he was being very cold and distant. But in that moment, in almost in an offhand way, he gave you some fantastic advice about managing this incredible chess ability you had, and about not being too high on yourself and being a good teammate and supporting others. And I remember reading that and stepping back and thinking, like, up to that point in the narrative, everything was giving me reason to dislike this character. Well, to me, it's a character. To you, it's your father. But at several points, you gave him his due, and you do that to other characters, which I thought was interesting. And the larger narrative, it's not a salacious story in the sense that people who come to the idea of cults, I think they come to it from sensational TV documentaries where the leader is, running a real sex cult where, you know, he has 20 wives and everyone's in robes and it's a compound that's completely impenetrable to the outside world. Is there a way you could communicate to my listeners, my viewers, how you came to understand this to be a cult?
It's a really, really great question, and I just appreciate your appreciation for what I was trying to do, because as I said quickly off the top, it was not my intention to write a cult expose.
I read the book because it was about chess. I love board games. I wasn't even expecting anything about cults.
Where I have found peace in my life as a human being is to make sense of the great Carl Jung quote, which is that we are not what happens to us, we are what we choose to become. But I would say then even further, if you now have become something that you are either happy with or at least fulfilled to the degree that you are, basically, if you're happy with the end game of your life, you don't get to re-choose and cherry pick the middle game or the opening then. You don't get to go back in time and decide what was okay and what wasn't. Now that doesn't mean you are making apologies for your abusers, nor does that mean you would exactly wish your path on your own children. But I believe the healthiest way to do that is to look at even people who did you wrong and try to understand that they may have actually been thinking they were doing their best, even if it didn't work out. And maybe even a more twist ending is maybe even some of them thought they were doing wrong, but it ended up being the best thing that happened to you, whether you like it or not. While I may have gone through abuse and there may have been trauma, it doesn't totally define me in terms of who I am. And the people who you might hold accountable for that are also human beings, and that actually this desire we have to put everybody in a black and white bucket of someone was just fundamentally all good or they are fundamentally all evil is actually very rarely the case. I was trying to tell a story that people might read and say, you know what, that was fucked up. There were some things that happened to him that aren't okay, but I actually haven't talked to my mom in 3 years, and maybe I actually do want to call my mom. Or, you know what, I actually am going to give my dad a call, because, you know what, I'm also someone who might look at my relationship and say, yeah, there were some fucked up things that happened to me, but is the relationship more valuable to me at this point than still being angry about those things? And that was my goal, was to like create a conversation around whether healing is being prioritized, which could be the best thing for you, over over maybe keeping a list about the bad things that happen. And my goal was not necessarily to cast blame, but to talk real about what happened and what I learned, and hopefully share that I think that healing relationships can be more important than the list you keep about those who did you wrong.
A lot of people who have no understanding of cults, they hear whatever the cult mythology is, which is often very far-fetched, and they think, well, whoever believes that is stupid. The cult you were in, the underlying mythology was fairly crazy. The nominal leader of the cult was a woman who purported to channel the wisdom of a 15th century English doctor, and she would go into these trances and start telling people what their cosmic purpose was and who they had vibrations with and all this stuff. And so I think there's a temptation to look at it and think whoever believes this is dumb or gullible. But as I was reading your book, I kept reminding myself that you're chess grandmaster. And not every smart person is a chess grandmaster, but every chess grandmaster has to have some baseline level of intelligence. So you're not dumb. There was a whole bunch of other kids in the collective who also played chess at a very high level. So it kind of opened my eyes and says, look, you know, I've tried chess. I got to a kind of intermediate level in chess. I never got further because of my own mental limitations, for which I have my own feelings of guilt and shame. But
You shouldn't.
I know how difficult
Chess is
chess
hard.
is.
Chess is hard.
Chess is very hard. And I know how difficult it is. And so I kept reminding myself, this is written by somebody who is a fantastic chess player. Maybe not the next Bobby Fischer, but something almost as good. The unifying quality of all these people who were drawn to this collective absolutely wasn't stupidity. You know, you had lawyers and very smart people. You describe it, this is toward the beginning of the book, you describe them basically as damaged souls. And I think your mother and father maybe are representative specimens where, they're people who are like really down on their luck, who are looking for something solid in their life, or maybe they're downwardly mobile sons and daughters of privilege. It sounds like maybe your father was like that. I think was it Williams College he went to, and then USC Law School. Is there any kind of universal template for the sort of person who gets drawn into a cult?
You can have a lot of smart people and otherwise outwardly successful people join cults, because I think one thing to remember is that we are not just our intellect as human beings, right? We are not just our brain. We are also emotional feeling beings, right? What you really need in your life at different stages might be different. At different stages of your life, you might be craving more of an intellectually curious pursuit, right? And there might be things you're attracted to that are stimulating your analytical, if you want to call it that, part of your experience, right? Your frontal lobe, for lack of a better way to put it. But you are also your cerebral cortex. You are also your stored long-term memories and the emotions associated with them. And the nervous system is hardwired to be a fully feeling experience. And your ability to analyze a situation is one thing. Your feelings and what you're looking for as far as filling those gaps, if you are in some ways, as I put it, a potentially damaged soul like my mother, who lost her father at 15 to a tragic car wreck, where the last words she said to him were, "I hate you," and my mom never really got over that. It was one of the few stories of her past she told me and my brother consistently, because "I hate you" and the word hate was like maybe the only curse word that was not allowed in our household, and my mom did not allow the word hate. Which I'm very grateful for, and that was why, right? And then she also lost her mother, not just figuratively, which immediately her mom became even more of a raging alcoholic after her husband died, and then ultimately died when my mom was young. And so, without getting into everyone's story who joined the collective, making it personal and specific to my mother, we can say that to some varying degree, like, I think there are people looking for stability, if you just want to be direct about it, whether it was conscious or not, looking for guidance of an authority / parental figure, right? And when you're looking for certain aspects of your feeling body and even your soul, if you believe you have one, to be sort of nourished versus your brain, I think that there are a lot of reasons why smart people, can look to give away their own agency and sign up for something, regardless of the validity of trance or people who believed in it or not. There's also parts of the collective that were probably immediate red flags to everybody in terms of how the money was actually run. I mean, there were stories of how people lost everything the moment they showed up in ways that were unfair, and ultimately probably immediately gave them a bad taste in their mouth. Like, this might not be the best idea, but because of the other thing they were longing for, they were still willing and did commit ultimately, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, I think that smart human beings are capable of giving away their power just as much as someone who you might say is below average intelligence, because I think questions about purpose and about meaning are questions that everybody has in terms of their existence, right? And I think that when you have a group that maybe says they have some answers, and there's a way of living that they are sort of professing will move you toward your higher self, there's a lot of people who would look to that for good reason, that aren't totally to be judged, right? Even if ultimately you can kind of say that, hey, you know, giving away your agency in that way may not have been the best idea.
When you're a kid, you already don't have agency because your parents are telling you what to do. There's a scene in the book where Trina, I think that's her name, the priestess,
Yeah.
she says, and this is in front of others, she says, "Danny, your purpose, capital P purpose, was a term of art in this collective. Your purpose is chess." And like, in that moment, did you actually believe that this was a cosmic imperative? That it wasn't just, hey, you're good at hockey, you should play hockey. It was, this is foreordained. Like, did you believe it in a cosmic spiritual sense in that moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was born into the Church of Immortal Consciousness, right? I grew up hearing trance. And again, for me, Trina and Dr. Duran were separate entities, right? So again, there's a lot of
So Duran was saying this.
Dr. Duran was saying this through Trina, right? And I had been in enough trances to have a certain level of acceptance that what Duran is saying is different than Trina. But whether it came from Duran or Trina, the idea of having a purpose on the planet, and maybe we should explain a little bit fundamentally for the listeners, kind of, what that was about the group, which was that in general, one of the things taught, one of sort of the agreements of everybody within the group, which again I was born into and raised under this, was that we are not physical beings trying to discover that we have a soul. We are spiritual beings having a physical experience, that reincarnation is fundamental. Karma, as much as a thing that can be thrown around, is more of like a spiritual fact, a golden rule of not just what goes around comes around within an individual lifetime. In fact, there's a lot of reasons to argue that the golden rule maybe doesn't make sense in an individual singular lifetime when we look at the injustice on the planet. But from Dr. Duran's teaching, the idea was that people have had many lifetimes, and that as spiritual beings evolving toward our highest self to hopefully achieve that one day, you are here with opportunities to learn lessons from others and to have a purpose, and that your spiritual being trumps your physical existence in terms of whatever it is you are meant to do. And so again, I think there's a lot of aspects to what I just described that are relatively benign and not necessarily harmful, and might even be good if under the right pretext, if not weaponized. But then when it came to the collective, the idea that if you think about it, every material possession, every biological relationship is essentially secondary to what your soul's purpose is. Now, all of a sudden, you can understand that what happens if someone's purpose is not going well? How do we create a conversation where someone's purpose is more important than their biological relationships, right? Because ultimately, your biological relationships are temporary to this lifetime, whereas your soul's purpose is the highest thing that you can achieve. So what I'm getting to long-winded way of answering your question is, as someone who was raised under this framework, right, and believed that we are all spiritual beings having a physical experience, and that reincarnation was my sort of, what do you want to call it? Every religious like philosophy has sort of the blind spots that are just accepted, right, regardless of whether other religions believe or not. The idea that my purpose could be really important was certainly something I believed in, right? And now how I felt when I was sort of ordained that chess was my purpose was actually not very much a celebration, because I had already had a couple of years of being a great chess player and enjoying it. The moment Duran told me that chess was my purpose, if anything, it felt a bit more like a discipline or a curse, to be honest, because I kind of understood at a young age what that meant. And it immediately sort of changed my relationship with the game. And as you know from reading my story, my relationship with chess started changing all of my actual relationships with people, including my own mom and et cetera, right? And so even if I didn't totally know what was coming then, there was a level of I could almost remember that trance from I was in a trance circle. I was told this was my purpose. It was more of a gut dropping thing to be told than like a celebration, right? Because I understood what that meant as far as our spiritual belief system that we were all practicing.
I kept trying to picture what these trancing sessions were like. In fact, you have many scenes in the book that I was trying to picture, including some that are unintentionally funny, like these stories that your mom would say about when she attended these special Friday night sessions for women. The women of the cult would try and work out their differences, and the way you described it, everyone would get hammered, and there was an expression, they would glass each other, which is when you throw your drink in somebody else's face. And you describe these things as just being nonstop fights and drunken arguments. In fact, your discussion of how women were treated by the cult is especially evocative, which is kind of perverse how terribly they were treated, because again, it was supposed to be this woman who was giving these spiritual pronouncements, when in fact it sounds like it was her husband who was running the whole show. And you described this situation where men would cynically use this idea of oh, I don't have a like vibration with my wife, so I'm going to marry somebody who's 20 years younger. And there were all these sort of castaway women. It's kind of pathetic. And a lot of them would just hang around because they were so, they wanted affirmation. They didn't know how to live on the outside. Even your own mother, it sounds like you lived in Colorado for a couple of years and she came back. And you mentioned offhand, I thought it was especially fascinating, you said that a lot of these women who had been rejected, they would go off into the nearby town to bars to try and find men. And you wrote, the men would only hang around long enough to find out how weird this little community was, and then they would take off.
To the larger point you were making, I would say that in my experience, the collective was a patriarchy posing as a matriarchy. And that Trina Camp, as the deity, the woman trancing the spirit who was ultimately giving sort of the teaching that people were following, was sort of professed as kind of the leader of the collective, right? As the spiritual trance medium. it's a matriarchy, given that ultimately Trina is sort of in charge, but in practice, really Stephen Camp and then my father was one of the men who left my mother and married a much younger woman. And I think it was very hard for single women to have a life outside of the collective as a woman with kids in a group that, for its faults, at least provides some sort of, I guess, space to live in safety. A lot of women had a hard time imagining life outside of that, right? So you sort of get trapped to a degree. There were women who were doing their best under those circumstances, right? As single women who had either been left by their husband or who had kids and also younger women who maybe hadn't been married yet. It was a difficult position to be in for them to have an expectation that any relationship they have should be spiritually ordained as
Right.
as okay, as a like vibration relationship, which was the terminology used to sort of describe, like, they should be your soulmate if you're going to be engaged in a sexual or intimate relationship. But then there were only so many men within the collective, right? They were either already married or whatever, not available. And so the idea of dating someone outside the collective was never allowed to be a date or a relationship that maybe could have developed into more, because it was immediately expected that if you were engaging in a relationship, that person should be brought to meet Dr. Duran and to be a part of the
I
collective,
see.
right? And
Wait,
so
so these guys that these women would meet, it wasn't just, oh, come on, I'll show you my community. They were actually brought into trancing
yeah,
sessions to,
both. I think it's a little bit of both, right?
okay,
Sometimes they would come and hear Dr. Duran. Other times they might meet Stephen Camp or Trina Camp as kind of an initial entry. But the expectation on the women was that if you're going to be engaged in a relationship, that it should be ordained, right? It should be something that is considered spiritual. And so there were many times where there would be a guy who was there and he was there for a month or there for a week. And I would kind of know that X woman is now dating this guy. And then as a kid, they would be gone, right? And sort of, again, obviously with perspective and time, I write about this more fully aware of what was going on. But then I also, was privy to at times different direct communications in terms of what the expectation was on that relationship. And so again, as a young person, as a kid, it kind of makes sense, right? Because you're like, oh, this is the way this should be. And again, it's a lot of time and perspective that kind of gives you the awareness of how unfair that was, right? How not okay that was.
can we talk about Stephen Camp? One of the unfortunate aspects of literature and movies is often the bad guy is more interesting than the good guy. Darth Vader is a more interesting character than Luke Skywalker. You do a lot to humanize Stephen Camp. I mean, he introduced you to chess, so you wouldn't be chief chess officer at chess.com if it weren't for Stephen Camp. But he breaks stereotypes. You describe him as this, like, at least superficially, a really friendly, easygoing, charismatic guy, as opposed to like some austere, humorless guru type. You give his backstory. Like, the easiest way to humanize somebody is often to give his backstory and show the challenges they overcame. If I remember correctly, he grew up in a religious Jewish household, I think upstate New York or something. And like a lot of the characters in the book, including your parents, went through this period of like seeking and just dabbling in every kind of sort of Eastern mythology, EST, rebirthing, that sort of stuff. Did he come across as easygoing? And it was only after time that people realized he was, I mean, all cult leaders are control freaks. Could you give us a sense of this combination of personality traits he had? Because it seems unique and it seems to break the mold of what we expect of manipulative cult leaders.
It's funny for you to frame it that way. I would actually say that I think a lot of cult leaders are charming and in many ways accessible to people, or
I've never
people.
met any cult leaders.
I don't think, Jonestown is built by Jim Jones if people aren't drawn to a magnetic personality, right? I don't think that, whether we think of other tragic endings of some of the most infamous cults, Waco or Heaven's Gate or others, I don't think that people follow someone who they don't like. And so obviously I can't speak for all of it in terms of, the leaders of every cult, but from my own education, I would actually say that whether or not the cult leaders slowly separate themselves as a necessary tool within the hierarchy, right? There are ways to create a dynamic of power and manipulation that somehow, put you on a pedestal before people even know you're on a pedestal. I think there are ways that happens. I would actually argue that part of what people were drawn to Stephen Camp about is that he was a very likable person, right? He was charming and ready to sort of, as I kind of wrote in the book, kind of shoot the shit with anybody. And I think that part of it is actually genuine, because I don't think you have an ability to sort of influence people's lives unless, again, there's a skill to understanding some people's lives, right? I think being a student of the human dynamic is something that a lot of cult leaders are, because it allows them to know what to say and when to say it. I think that there maybe were more parts of his personality and more parts of his sort of communication style that were premeditated in terms of his ability to manipulate people than I even understood, right? I think as a kid, I grew up with a certain perspective about his good traits, and then maybe some of his traits that were hard for me, but I thought that they were ultimately maybe okay as well. And I think with time, I've come to gain the perspective that while he was very charming, I think he was also very, very manipulative of the human experience, and he knew how to pull on people's heartstrings to kind of get them to sign their own covert contract that they were willing to do what he asked them to do versus kind of telling them what to do.
Yeah, you want someone to do something, make it seem like it's their idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
The interplay between Stephen Camp and your dad, Steve Rensch, is fascinating because it almost sounds like a classic good cop, bad cop situation. Do you think on some level that Stephen Camp knew that in order to preserve his charisma and likability, he needed a sort of security chief who would do the dirty work, like actually in some cases rough people up, and
Yeah.
that on some,
Ultimately, I do.
because it's rare for cult leaders to create a power competition in their cult, which ultimately is what resulted, because your dad became a center of power, and that's one of the things, cult leadership 101. You're the boss. You don't want to create a second boss, and it sounds like your dad really leaned into that role of being like the security chief, the bad cop.
I think it's a fair observation. Again, this is something that I've had my own perspective of, and then as I wrote this book and as I talked to trusted sort of adult figures that I grew up with, who I still have a good relationship with, and kind of have asked them their perspective, maybe to both kind of validate some stories or feelings or memories, but also just to have a conversation. And I won't share specifically who those people were necessarily, but I will say that there was a bit of a common thread that a lot of people felt like my dad was simultaneously, he liked the fact that he also had power, but also simultaneously kind of taken advantage of and sort of manipulated, and also maybe kind of too stupid to realize that, right? My dad's a very smart man and, practicing attorney, and I think my dad is intelligent in a lot of ways, but when it came to maybe the emotional intelligence of what was going on and sort of understanding the dynamic of where, by him sort of being the bull in the china shop, which was literally what he was sort of told his job was to kind of shake things up.
Crackheads. Yeah.
Yeah, he was sort of put in a position to be influential and sort of powerful in terms of how people looked at him and revered him and maybe feared him. And maybe that was my dad's shortcoming, is that maybe he enjoyed that, right? But that ultimately allowed Stephen Camp to make sure that he was the one sort of doing the cleanup work, which, again, as you said, the fastest way to get something done is not to tell someone what to do, but to make it their idea, or let's say the most effective way to make it long-term effective. And I think that the idea that Stephen Camp was sort of always the person who could clean up a mess that my dad might have caused, I think ultimately was deliberate, or at least that seems to be a consensus that people have, right? And obviously my dad is not a victim either, right? My dad, while he may have been to some degree not aware of or more manipulated than he wanted to be conscious of, my dad also was a powerful man, the number two, literally, because there was a direct hierarchy of how people ranked, and to whatever degree you could say took advantage of the system, right? He married their oldest daughter, who was almost 20 years younger than him, and
She
in
was
many ways
19.
19 years
19.
old. My dad
Yeah.
was 38, she was 19, and there's no real world where that's acceptable. And so, my dad was, as you said, he was a complicated individual in it, but then ultimately the power that kind of came to him and Marlo as sort of the number two couple, if you would say, Trina and Steven, the number one couple, Marlo and Steve, the number two, and my dad inheriting money, which he ultimately did later on in his life, I think led to a real power clash that I share. Frankly, probably don't even share many of the rated R details of what really went
Well, you
down
were
over
at the
that few
center
year
of it.
period,
I
but I
mean,
but I was at the center of a lot of the
yeah.
stuff that happened there.
Does the Church of Immortal Consciousness still exist in any form?
No, Trina Camp died in 2022. I share that in the book in December of 2022. She passed away. While I would actually say that the collective had imploded on itself long before that, at least a few years before that. A lot of that really stemmed from Stephen and Trina's own children sort of turning on them and or against the the collective, the cult way of life. As I described in the book, my general experience of that was probably less of leaving a cult and more of becoming aware that this thing was destroying itself and learning to live within the eye of the hurricane in a way that didn't affect me and my young wife and children. And I think that, anyone who doesn't live in a cult might kind of look at that and go, why wouldn't you have escaped? But anyone who maybe has ever been in that type of environment, especially when your emotional well-being and everything that you knew is sort of wrapped up in the dynamic, it's not as simple as you would think, right? To kind of come to terms with how exactly you expect your life to go on from that. And so, yeah, I think my experience was kind of learning to live in the eye of a hurricane that was sort of destroying itself. And I share about how that happened in the book. But yeah, it was a wild thing to watch it sort of explode and destroy itself over that period that probably started with what I share in the book with my dad inheriting money and kind of this like rift internally with them, and then ultimately ending with my last conversations with Stephen Camp, and where my wife and I and our children ultimately moved to Utah, where we live now.
So I once had a conversation with two brothers who had been Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jehovah's Witness sect is interesting because it kind of blurs the line between Christianity and cult. And they left the Johos, as they derisively call it. Don't use that term with Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a term of abuse, but they used it, so I'm using it. And then they went to university, and their family wouldn't talk to them because Johos aren't supposed to go to university. And they told me that because they had grown up as Jehovah's Witnesses, they were, in retrospect, they know that they were prey to the first person on campus who handed them a pamphlet. And it so happened the first person who handed them a pamphlet on campus was an evangelical Christian. And so for like 5 years, they became evangelical Christians. And then they stopped being that. And they realized that their experience as Jehovah's Witnesses has left them with a kind of cult-shaped hole in their brain. And that they're just forever going to be, they're very self-aware about it, that they have to be careful about it. Did you find that you have a cult-shaped hole in your brain? Because I notice, not saying you're in a cult now, of course, but you're very fluent in a lot of like psychological language and idioms, and you've clearly internalized a lot of the language of mental self-help, and maybe like that, which is healthy. But do you feel like it's inevitable that somebody who goes through what you did when you were a kid requires some very strong organizing principle for living a mentally stable life, which could be in the form of a cult, it could be in the form of religion, or it could be in the form of, I say, rigidly applied and expressed doctrine of psychological health?
It's interesting. I mean, hearing of their experience, I think, is maybe more typical than the not than those who aren't. At the same time, I would say that I think I could also maybe say that perhaps they just haven't fully deconstructed their belief system yet. I think that if you talk to a lot of people who've left other churches, whether of the mainstream denominations we are aware of that aren't called a cult necessarily because of the size, but maybe some would argue that they have cult-ish tendencies, right? I've shared that in my humble opinion and experience, I think that spirituality and storytelling, whether through religious frameworks or otherwise, can be beneficial if it challenges people to ask big questions and to reflect on what the meaning of life is through the lens of what is my potential to make the world a better place? What is my potential to have an impact?
Something larger than yourself.
Yes, exactly. I think that having a sense of your place in the larger universal community can be healthy. I think that people not only need more community in life, I would argue, than ever on our planet. And I think that it can be healthy to have a sense of contribution to your larger tribe, even just on an evolutionary level. I think that those things can be very healthy. And I think if stories as a mechanism to challenge people to ask life's biggest questions are effective, then that can be a good thing. That said, I would argue that any religion, whether considered an occult, OCCULT group or belief, or a mainstream religion, says that it has all the answers, is the moment that any religion can become a cult. And that, in my view, saying you have all the answers and or that you believe you can influence someone's path to God is a cultish thing to do versus helping people ask questions and find their own relationship with faith, whether they want one or not. And so what I would say is, I think deconstructing your own relationship with a higher power, whether your higher power is humanitarian because you believe on a moral level that your contribution is an important one to make for whatever reason you do, whether there's a religious or spiritual belief system, or to the debate of consciousness being fundamental or time and space being fundamental. There's a lot of discussions about that right now in the scientific community. I personally think that it is possible that consciousness is fundamental, which can mean the idea that if we're evaluating a possible metaphysical existence, I think that there can be benefits to believing that we are trying to become our best selves and that maybe there is a consciousness or some sort of life after death. But even if you don't believe that, you don't need a religious framework to be your best self and contribute, right? But I would say that you shouldn't be looking to give away your power or to pretend that other people have the answers for you in your relationship with becoming your best self, right? So that's what I would say. I would actually say that everyone should deconstruct their relationship through the lens of, is this kind of structure, is this faith system, is this framework, Jehovah's Witness or otherwise, beneficial for me? And before you look to rebuild, you kind of have to let the scaffolding fully fall.
Is that the equivalent of hitting rock bottom?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I think that maybe for some people they would describe that as hitting spiritual rock bottom.
Because you kind of did that a couple of times in your narrative.
I think so. And I think, so I guess what I'm answering is, I don't totally agree that my being or brain needs something to fill the hole that was left by the Church of Immortal Consciousness. I don't think that that's what I'm looking for. I think I have a very holistic view now of where mental health meets a belief in some sort of spiritual existentialism, which is what I would describe myself of. Let's focus less on, my spiritual beliefs are rooted less on the why we're here, which inherently is a story and a dogma and or a belief that something that maybe you are ascribing meaning to something that might be meaningless. I'm going to focus less on the why I'm here, which is ultimately I get to decide the why, just like anybody else, and more focus on the how, meaning at some point something did come from nothing, whether this is a simulation experience or something else. I tend to have a little bit of having rebuilt my own scaffolding based on a little bit of a spiritual view around the fact that existence itself is a miracle. The fact that we are here is fascinating.
Yeah.
And so I sort of rebuilt my own spiritual views based on an existentialist point of view and have wrapped up my own meaning, my own why, my own choice around, how I try to find value and purpose on the planet, separate from, how I believe that life itself is a miracle. That's what I would describe my own spiritual view as. And I don't think I'm necessarily looking for a thing to fill the hole, as more of just being aware of things that I find to be useful to help me be the best version of myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, you've introduced a whole bunch of issues that break my brain when I'm thinking of them at night. I noticed there's a chessboard in the background. Do you still play?
Well, I do whenever I can on the chess.com app, the phone. I mean, I have that's actually an amazing chessboard that was given to me by some, and then there's another one below it. There's the big board and the small board, but I mean, chess will forever be a part of my life. Obviously, I achieved one of the highest titles in the game as an international master, and I hang out with all the best chess players in the world. And when I still get to do it, I provide chess commentary, which is my first love, and I love to do that. I do not get to play as much as I would like anymore. That's just the truth. It's more of a casual game on the app than it is actually competing in a high level tournament.
What's the best response to a Queen's Pawn opening?
There are a lot of good responses. I played the Nimzo-Indian. You can also just play the Queen's Gambit and play D5. I think that the computers would tell you that objectively Black should just play D5, but I think that either of the Nimzo-Indian or the King's Indian positions, depending on your style, can be very good.
All right. News you can use. Thank you for that.
There you go.
Danny Rensch's new book, critically acclaimed, is called Dark Moves. Thanks so much for being on the Quillette Podcast.
Thanks for having me.